On a night when the wind clawed at the mountains like a starving wolf, a lone rider heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm, the fragile cry of newborn life. What he found in that frozen clearing would pull him into a battle far colder and far more dangerous than the winter itself. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about the fire that refuses to die even in the darkest blizzard, and the love that can outlast a lifetime of silence. If you believe the Wild West still holds secrets worth hearing, and if you want more true grit tales of justice, redemption, and hearts that never quit, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Because some stories stay with you, and this one might just change the way you see the frontier forever. Bitter Creek Valley wore winter like a shroud that year. Snow lay heavy on the pines, bending branches low until they creaked under the weight. The wind moved through the high ridges with a long, mournful howl, like some restless spirit caught between the mountains. Folks in town said it was the kind of cold that got into a man's bones and stayed there. Gideon Harlow had learned to believe them. He moved slow along the slope, boots crunching through drifts, the stock of his rifle resting easy against his shoulder. Hunting wasn't for sport these days. It was a matter of keeping meat on the table and hides by the fire. Out here on the northern ridge, a man could go half a day without hearing his own echo. Only the wind kept him company, and that was enough for Gideon. Then he heard it, something that didn't belong. At first, it was so faint the wind nearly swallowed it whole. A high, thin cry, brittle against the roar of the storm. He stopped, turning his head, breath curling in pale clouds. Another cry followed, sharper this time. Not the voice of any animal he knew. A child's cry. No more than one. Gideon felt his chest tighten. He'd heard coyotes make off with lambs before the desperate bleating cut short. But this had a different edge. It was softer, human, and full of cold fear. He stepped forward, scanning the slope ahead. The trail wound toward a stand of black spruce, their tops swaying against a sky the color of old tin. The snow here was deep enough to grab at his knees, but he pushed on, letting instinct pull him toward the sound. The cries came again, thinner now, almost smothered by the wind. Gideon's jaw set. Someone was out there, and by the sound of it, they didn't have long. The spruce opened onto a clearing barely wide enough to hold an old fence line, just two rotted posts still standing, strung with rust-bitten wire. At the far post a figure stood, bound to the wood, half buried in snow. For a moment, the storm pressed in so hard he thought his eyes had tricked him. But no, the shape was real, swaying slightly in the wind. He closed the distance fast. Isa Merrick. Even under the frost clinging to her lashes, he knew her face. He'd known it the first time she'd looked back at him, across the Merrick family's pasture, all those years ago. But the Isa before him now was pale as the snow. She stood in, her lips cracked, her cheeks marked with dark bruises blooming in cruel colors. Her arms were wrenched behind her, the wire biting deep through her coat sleeves. Snow dusted her hair, frozen into strands. At her feet lay three small bundles, huddled together in the lee of the post. He crouched, peeling back a flap of the ragged blanket. A baby's face peeked out, eyes squeezed shut, lips trembling, a faint whimper breaking from its tiny chest. Two more lay beside it, silent, but breathing, wrapped in what looked like the torn remains of a woman's nightgown. Isa's head lifted just barely. She blinked, and for a heartbeat, her eyes lit with recognition, then hardened with something else. Not just shock, not just fear, something older, sharper. Gideon felt it like a blow. She still carried it, the anger from the day she'd turned away from him. But there was no time to touch that wound now. Easy, he said, voice low against the wind. He dropped his rifle in the snow and drew the hunting knife from his boot. The wire clung stubborn as a snake, tearing at her coat and flesh as it came free. She didn't cry out, didn't even flinch, but he felt the shiver run through her when the last loop fell away. Her knees buckled at once. He caught her around the waist, feeling the dead weight of exhaustion and cold. He lifted her like she weighed nothing. "Got you," he murmured, not sure if she even heard. Kneeling again, he gathered the babies one by one, tucking them against his chest inside his heavy coat, wrapping the wool tighter to trap what little heat they had left. Their skin was chilled, but the shallow breaths kept coming. That was something. The wind rose cutting at his face. Snow swirled thick enough to blur the trees. He adjusted his grip, Isa cradled in one arm. The babies bound close to both of them and turned back toward the trail. The climb back up the slope felt twice as long. Each step sank him knee-deep, and the drifts closed behind him, as if the mountain meant to erase their passage. Isa's head lolled against his chest, her breath slow, almost soundless. He kept his own breathing steady, more for her than for himself. Bitter Creek wasn't kind to those caught in her teeth. But Gideon Harlow had decided no one he could reach was going to die out here tonight. The ridge fell away toward his homestead, a squat cabin crouched beneath a line of pines. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. The fire he'd left that morning had gone cold hours ago. He shifted Isa's weight as they reached the door, nudged it open with his boot, and stepped into the still air inside. It was warmer than outside, but not by much. He lowered Isa onto the bed of quilts by the hearth, careful not to jar the babies. One by one, he set them in a basket near the fireplace, tucking them in with a folded deerskin. For a moment, the only sound in the cabin was the moan of wind beyond the walls. Gideon stood there, the cold seeping from his coat, and looked at the woman he'd once planned to marry. Her face was thinner, sharper than he remembered, marked by suffering that had nothing to do with the storm outside. There were 100 questions he could have asked, and 100 things he could have said. But now wasn't the time for any of them. He turned to the hearth, crouched low, and began stacking kindling, with hosts that had learned long ago to work without waste. Outside, the snow drove hard against the shutters. Inside, the first sparks caught, and the flames began to push back the dark. It would be a long night, and Bitter Creek, for all her frozen cruelty, had just delivered him something he thought he'd lost forever. The wind did not let up that night. It pressed against the cabin walls in long, groaning waves, rattling the shutters and seeping through every seam in the boards. Inside the fire, Gideon had coaxed back to life, hissed and popped its light, spilling low and warm across the room. Gideon worked without fuss. He had pulled off his boots, set them near the hearth to dry, and now moved between Isa on the bed and the basket where the 3 newborns lay. He kept the pace of a man who understood time's weight in a storm, steady, deliberate, no motion wasted. Isa lay propped against folded quilts, her shoulders wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar smoke. Her face, still pale beneath the bruises, was turned toward him, but her eyes held their own, whether a mix of exhaustion, weariness, and something he could not quite name. She had not forgotten who he was. That much was clear. But neither had she forgotten the day she believed he'd left her behind. That belief still lived in her, sharp-edged the way a splinter stays buried under skin. And yet here he was, kneeling beside her children, checking their breathing, tucking the blankets closer to their tiny chests. She wanted to look away, but her gaze kept drifting back. Gideon didn't speak. There was nothing to say that would change what she thought, not tonight. Instead, he poured his care into small things, holding a cup of warmed goat's milk to each infant's lips, waiting while they swallowed in clumsy gulps, adjusting the folds of the blanket so no cold air could slip in, placing another log on the fire before its heat began to dip. From her place on the bed, Isa felt the strangest pull, gratitude and anger tangled so tight she couldn't tell them apart. Every small act of his care made her chest ache, not only because he was saving them, but because part of her hated that it mattered so much to her after all this time. With the 3 infants now wrapped tight and laid close together for warmth, Gideon rose and crossed to the low wooden shelf in the corner. From a wicker basket, he pulled a strip of smoked venison and a piece of cornbread wrapped in clean cloth. Setting them in a wooden bowl, he poured a tin cup of warm water from the kettle hanging over the fire. He carried it all to Isa. "Eat," he said softly, but in a way that left no room for refusal. Isa looked at the bowl, then at him, hesitation flickering in her eyes, as if she wasn't sure she had the strength to try, but her hand lifted at last, taking it from him. The smoky scent of venison rose up, mingled with the faint sweetness of cornbread. She chewed slowly small bites, each one feeling like it pulled her body back from the edge. Gideon sat beside the bed, a strip of clean cloth and a dark glass bottle in his hand. "Let me see your arm," he said, his gaze fixed on the raw marks circling her wrist. Isa stiffened for a heartbeat instinct, urging her to pull away, but she offered it to him. When his fingers touched her skin, she bit down on her lip to keep from making a sound. The wound was deep and angry, where the teeth of barbed wire had carved into her flesh. Gideon poured a measure of the strong-smelling liquor over it, his hands steady, but never rough. The sharp sting flared hot, the smell of alcohol filling the air. He wrapped the cloth around her wrist with neat, certain movements, then checked the bruises along her arm, her shoulder, and the places she hadn't been able to shield when the blows came. No comments, no pity in his eyes, only the quiet focus of a man treating each wound as a knot that had to be undone if she was to survive the night. Isa watched him from up close, seeing the small creases at the corners of his eyes, marks left by years in the open air, by winters that had taken their toll. She didn't know what to call the feeling that stirred in her, the urge to trust colliding with the need to keep her walls intact. "All right," Gideon murmured when he was done standing to put away the bottle. He didn't touch her again, just went back to the fire, tending it, as if tending her had simply been one more task in a long list that needed doing before dawn. Isa lay back, her hands wrapped in clean cloth, catching the faint scent of cornbread on her fingers. Across the room, the sound of him shifting the logs blended with the wind outside, and for the first time in many days, she felt enough strength to close her eyes. Morning arrived gray and heavy, the light from the small window falling across the floorboards in thin stripes. The wind had eased, but the snow outside lay deep enough to bury the fence posts. Gideon was already up feeding the fire, the smell of boiling water and pine resin drifting through the air. Isa stirred the blanket slipping from her shoulders. She saw him crouched over the basket again, checking the babies one by one. His hair was still damp from the snow he'd brushed off himself earlier. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow forearms, marked with the kind of work-earned lines that never left a man. He didn't notice her watching at first. When he did glance her way, he only gave a short nod before returning to his work. The babies were warmer now, their breathing stronger. One made a faint squeaky sound, and Gideon's mouth moved in something just shy of a smile. Isa caught it and looked away quickly, unsure why it left her unsettled. After tending to them, he crossed to a small workbench in the corner. From the top drawer, he pulled out a block of pale cedar and set it on the table. His knife came from the pocket of his trousers, the blade catching a moment's firelight as he flicked it open. Isa frowned slightly, wondering why he would bother with carving when there was still so much to do. But he worked with the calm focus of a man who knew exactly why he was doing something, even if no one else did. The knife whispered against the wood, shaving off thin curls that fell onto the table. Slowly, letters began to appear, simple, unadorned, but sure of themselves. Isa watched the shapes take form. Ellen. then Rose, then May. Her lips parted. She had never told him their names. Not last night, not ever. No one here knew them, but her. He finished the last letter, smoothed the edges with his thumb, then stood and walked to the hearth. Above it hung a narrow shelf with only a lantern, a small Bible, and a smooth river stone. Gideon took a bent nail from the shelf, set it into the beam above the fire, and tapped it in with the butt of his knife. The cedar plank went up in the center, the names catching the morning light that filtered in beside the flicker of the flames. Isa's throat tightened. She wanted to ask how he knew, but the question felt too fragile, like it might break something she wasn't ready to lose. Gideon looked at her then, meeting her eyes across the room. He didn't smile, didn't speak, only gave the smallest nod, the kind that carried weight without needing words. Then he turned back to the fire, adding another log with deliberate care. The wind outside gave one last low sigh, as if tired of testing the cabin's walls. Inside the cedar, names hung steady above the hearth, their edges warm in the glow. Isa lay back against the quilt staring at them, and for the first time since she'd woken, bound to that fence post, she felt something loosen in her chest. She didn't speak. Neither did he. But between them, the distance had shifted, not gone, but no longer so wide. The snow had thinned to a lazy drift by mid-morning, the wind quiet enough that the creek's slow gurgle could be heard again through the trees. Gideon was outside splitting kindling when the sound of a single horse approached from the south trail. The gait was steady, cautious, the kind that carried news rather than haste. Aaron Lyle came into view, his old sorrel gelding, puffing clouds into the cold air. Aaron was wrapped in a weathered buffalo hide coat scarf, drawn high over his mouth. He reined up near the porch, tugging his scarf down as he leaned in the saddle. "Morning, Gideon," he said, voice roughened by the ride. Gideon set the axe aside, resting his hands on the haft. "Morning, Aaron." Aaron glanced toward the cabin door, where no one stood, but the faintest sound of movement inside told him Isa was there. He swung a leg over and dismounted, boots crunching in the snow. "I got something you need to hear," he said, lowering his voice. Gideon stepped closer, snow squeaking underfoot. "Go on." Aaron's gaze shifted, uneasy, like a man debating how much truth to spill. "Words come down from Calvert's Crossing. Caleb Vance is telling folks a hell of a story. Says Isa's been kidnapped, that you dragged her up here against her will." Gideon's eyes narrowed just slightly. "And they believe him. Some do," Aaron said, shaking his head. "He's also been talking about your past, stirring up old ash. Telling anyone who'll listen, you were part of a wartime slaughter down in Dry Hollow. Claims there's a warrant with your name on it." The air between them seemed to cool another few degrees. Gideon didn't move, didn't ask what was on that so-called paper. Aaron shifted his weight, stamping a boot in the snow. "Now you and me both know how these things go. A man like Vance doesn't need the law, just enough folks to nod along so he can make his move. You ride into town to protest, you don't come back." Inside the cabin, Isa was still. She could hear the murmur of their voices through the door, the occasional sharp note carrying through the wood. Her hands tightened around the edge of the blanket in her lap. Back outside, Aaron's eyes met Gideon's in that steady, measuring way. "I gotta ask, though." He hesitated, scratching at the stubble on his jaw. "Dry Hollow, is there any truth to it?" A crow called somewhere in the pines, the sound stark in the quiet. Gideon's expression didn't change. "Not a conversation I'm having, Aaron." Aaron studied him a beat longer, then gave a slow nod. "Fair enough. Just thought you ought to know what's coming. Vance means to ride up here, and he'll bring more than words when he does." Gideon's gaze lifted toward the ridgeline, where the ski was the flat color of pewter. He gave a single nod. "Appreciate the warning." Aaron exhaled, the breath hanging white between them. Watch yourself, Gideon. Man like him won't stop till he's got what he came for, or till someone stops him. Gideon didn't answer that. Aaron mounted up, turned his sorrel toward the trail, and rode off at the same steady pace, leaving only hoofprints in the snow and the faint smell of leather behind him. When Gideon stepped back into the cabin, Isa was by the hearth, shifting one of the babies in her arms. Her eyes searched his face, but he didn't offer anything. "You have visitors often?" she asked lightly, though the question carried weight. "Not the kind that matter," he replied, shrugging off his coat and hanging it on the peg. Then he crouched to check the fire, the glow of the coals reflecting in his eyes. He didn't tell her about the warrant. Not yet. What good would it do to hand her another kind of fears instead? After a silent meal, he set to work. First came the doors. The front got an extra crossbar, thick oak, notched to drop into place fast if trouble came. The back was reinforced with planks from a dismantled storage bin. Next, the windows. He cut strips of scrap iron from an old stoveplate, fixing them over the inside frames so the shutters couldn't be kicked in. Isa watched from the table, feeding the smallest child, her expression unreadable. She didn't ask why. Maybe she didn't need to. When the light began to fade, Gideon moved to the shelf where he kept his ammunition. He laid out cartridges on the table, counted them twice, then reloaded the rifle and the Colt he'd kept in its holster since before the snow came. He set aside a small pouch of jerky dried apples and a flask, not for himself, but for her, though he didn't say so. By the time he was done, the cabin felt different. Still the same four walls, but with a quiet tension threaded through them now, like the air before a storm. Isa felt it too. She shifted the baby to her shoulder, patting its back, eyes flicking to the rifle leaning by the door. Gideon glanced at her once as if to speak, then thought better of it. Some things didn't need saying. Not tonight. Outside, the sky had gone the deep blue of twilight, and the first star pricked through. Inside, the fire burned low, but steady, throwing long shadows across the floor. Gideon stood in that half-light, silent, already turning over in his mind the ways he might keep them safe when the ridge stopped being quiet. The ridge was quiet that afternoon, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to have paused, as if the whole mountain was holding its breath. Gideon stood on the porch, eyes scanning the tree line. Isa was inside, humming low to one of the babies, but her voice faded when the faint thud of hooves reached her ears. They came into sight one by one, 4 riders in dark coats, their shapes moving out of the pines like shadows taking form. Caleb Vance rode at the front, his black gelding tossing its head against the bit. The man sat straight in the saddle, a figure carved in hard lines, his hat brim low, hiding most of his expression. Gideon stepped down from the porch, boots crunching in the thin crust of snow. He didn't touch the rifle leaning by the door, not yet. "Afternoon," Granger Vance called, his voice carrying the easy tone of a man who knew the ground he stood on, or thought he did. "Afternoon," Gideon replied evenly. Vance reined in a few yards from him, the other riders fanning slightly to either side. His eyes slid toward the cabin door. "Heard tell you've been keeping company with a lady. Pretty thing. Shame the way she left home." Before Gideon could speak, the cabin door opened. Isa stepped out, the smallest of her daughters in her arms, the other hand tightening the shawl around her shoulders. Her cheeks were pale against the cold, but her eyes burned steady as she looked at Vance. "You came all this way," she said, voice tight. "For what? Haven't you done enough? You left me, left us tied out there in the snow. Now you come riding up like you have some right to be here." A shadow of a smile touched Vance's lips. "That's not how I recall it, Isa. Seems to me you're forgetting who put you in that fine house, who fed you, clothed you, fed me." She cut in, her voice rising. "You fed me with lies. And when I gave you daughters instead of a son, you called them curses." Vance's gaze slid past her to Gideon. And what's this? You standing beside him now, funny Isa. You never asked him why he really left you years ago. Never asked him what he did before he came crawling back here. Her brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Oh, I reckon he didn't tell you. Dry Hollow ring any bells? Granger Vance turned his grin toward Gideon, now all teeth. Funny though, last time I saw you was back in Dry Hollow. Snow not unlike this. I remember, because I pulled you out from under a man, aiming to put a bullet in your skull. You remember that, don't you? I remember, Gideon said at last, his tone flat as stone. Then you remember you owe me, Vance went on. Which makes me wonder why you're standing in my way now. His gaze flicked toward the cabin again, and this time there was no mistaking the intent in it. She's not yours, Gideon said. She's mine by law and by right, Vance countered, voice sharpening. You think the paper says different. I think you've got no claim worth speaking of. The air between them was taut, brittle. The other riders shifted in their saddles, hands never far from their belts. Isa stood rigid, her daughter pressed to her chest, her breath clouding in the frigid air. She looked from one man to the other, the words she'd always believed about Gideon, suddenly not so sure in her mind. Then, as if the mountain itself had chosen its moment, the sky darkened. A wall of white swept down the slope, wind screaming through the pines. Snow slashed sideways, cutting the view to a few yards in seconds. Horses shied and tossed their heads. Vance cursed under his breath, pulling his scarf over his teeth. This isn't over, Granger, he shouted above the howl. His eyes lingered on Isa for a heartbeat longer than they should have. Then he yanked his reins and led his riders back into the storm. When the last hoofbeat was gone, the wind carried only its own roar. Gideon brushed the snow from his coat and stepped inside Isa just behind him, clutching the baby, as though the storm had followed them in. You knew him, she said quietly. Long time ago, Gideon replied. He said he saved your life. People say a lot of things. She studied him, the lines of his face, the calm that never seemed to crack. And for the first time, a seed of doubt worked its way into the story she'd believed for years, the story that had painted Gideon as the man who'd left her behind. Outside, the storm deepened, swallowing the ridge in white. Inside, the fire crackled, and the silence between them was no longer the same. The storm had not eased by morning. It came in long, snarling gusts that clawed at the cabin walls and whistled through every gap between the timbers. Snow lay deep against the door, a white barricade that made the outside world feel even farther away. Inside, the fire struggled to keep its breath against the cold pressing in from every direction. Gideon stood by the window, scanning the blizzard for shapes he half expected and wholly dreaded to see. His gut told him Vance wasn't finished. The man's pride, like his greed, was too big to let go. It came as a shadow first, then another, and another. 10 riders this time, moving slow through the storm, their dark outlines breaking apart and reforming in the whiteout. At their center, Caleb Vance rode with a confidence that looked unnatural in such weather. Beside him, hunched against the wind, was Aaron Lyle. Gideon's jaw tightened. Aaron's eyes met his through the swirling snow, not defiant like the others, but weighted like a man, walking a road he'd rather not take. Isa stood near the hearth, cradling one of the babies, her face pale but composed. She saw the look in Gideon's eyes before he even spoke. It's them, he said simply. She moved to the corner without argument, bundling the children together in their furs. Gideon stepped outside, the wind striking him like a wall. Snow stung his cheeks and eyes, the gusts pulling at his coat as if to drag him back inside. The riders reined in, a dozen yards from the porch. Vance leaned forward in his saddle, snow clinging to the brim of his hat and the shoulders of his coat. Morning, Granger, he called, voice roughened by the cold. Thought I'd give you a chance to come clean before the law gets involved. You brought a lot of men for a conversation, Gideon answered, voice even, but carrying over the wind. Vance's grin was humorless. This isn't just about her anymore. Folks need to know the truth about you. He let the words hang, letting the storm carry them. You were there, Dry Hollow. You gave the order. You cut down women, children, anyone who stood in the way. I've been carrying that knowledge for years, waiting for the day you slipped up. From behind him, Aaron shifted in his saddle, his gaze flicking from Vance to Gideon. The storm's howl nearly drowned out the sound of leather creaking under his gloves. Gideon's voice was steady, but his eyes burned. You tell that lie one more time, Vance, and I'll put you in the ground. It's no lie, Vance said loud enough for every man to hear. These hills remember. So do I. Gideon took a step forward through the snow, the wind swirling around his legs, forcing him to plant each boot like an anchor. Dry Hollow happened because you made it happen. You wanted that valley for yourself, its water, its pasture. You sent men to burn the homesteads, drive out the settlers. And when I stood in your way, you made sure I was branded the villain. You think I don't know it was you who sent the letter to Issa, telling her I'd run off with another woman? The name hit like a hammer. Issa's head snapped up from where she stood at the cabin door. You, she started, but her voice caught. Gideon's gaze didn't waver from Vance. Every mile between us, every year she thought I'd abandoned her. It was your doing. Vance's smile faltered for the first time. You've got a fine imagination, Granger. But it was too late. Issa's eyes wide with disbelief fixed on Vance. A dozen memories crashed through her, the way certain rumors never matched how letters sometimes arrived. Already opened the look in Gideon's eyes. That day they parted. Pieces slid together, sharp and merciless. Aaron shifted again this time, with something heavier in his expression. He'd been there in the old days, had heard things that never sat right. Seen Vance ride away from Dry Hollow, without a speck of soot on him, while others were still digging graves. His hand dropped to his revolver, not in threat yet, but in thought. Vance noticed. What's the matter, Lyle? You forgetting who signs your pay? Aaron's voice was quiet, but it cut clean through the wind. I remember just fine. I also remember the smell of Dry Hollow. And I remember you never shedding a tear over it. Vance's hand twitched toward his pistol. Careful. The storm seemed to hold its breath. Aaron's fingers tightened on the grip. In the howl of the wind, he heard the ghosts of Dry Hollow, the cries, the crackle of burning roofs. His heart pounded once, twice. Then Vance's thumb moved for the hammer. Aaron drew first. You first. The world exploded. Guns roared, but the wind tore the sound into pieces, swallowing half of it. Snow-blinded gun smoke mingled with ice in the air. Gideon dove behind the porch rail, returning fire with sharp, deliberate shots. A rider toppled into the snow. Another's horse screamed and bolted into the whiteout. Aaron wheeled his horse, firing into the flank of Vance's men, forcing them to split their aim. Gideon moved like a man who'd fought in worse storms than this, reloading between bursts, his eyes never losing track of where Vance was. A bullet splintered the porch post inches from his head. Another grazed his coat. He dropped one man with a shot to the shoulder, another with a clean hit to the chest. Then Vance broke through the haze, charging straight for the porch with his revolver raised. Gideon swung his rifle up, but the hammer caught on the rail. He was half a breath from death when Aaron's pistol cracked from the side. Vance jerked in the saddle, his revolver firing wild into the air, before he toppled backward into the snow. The wind swallowed the sound of his body hitting the drift. The rest of his men broke. Some fled into the storm. Others dropped their weapons and raised their hands. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. Aaron sat still for a long moment, the smoke from his pistol curling into the frozen air. Then he dismounted, trudging through the snow to where Vance lay. His breath fogged in front of him, as he looked down. "Reckon that debt's paid," he said, holstering his gun. Gideon straightened, his rifle lowered. His breath was ragged, his coat torn, but he was standing. Isa came out onto the porch, the snow swirling around her. She didn't speak at first, just looked at him, the trust he thought he'd lost forever shining in her eyes. The storm raged on, but inside that look, Gideon felt the first true clearing in years. The storm had spent the night, tearing at the mountains, but by morning, it was only a ghost of itself, soft snow, drifting down the wind, reduced to a tired whisper. The world outside lay white and unbroken, save for the churned-up patch where men had stood and fought. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, throwing a steady heat into the air. Gideon sat slumped in the wooden chair near the hearth, his shirt torn and darkened at the shoulder where the bullet had grazed him. He was pale, but his eyes were still steady, watching the flames like a man measuring their worth against the cold. Aaron Lyle stood by the door, his hat in his hands. There was a heaviness in his stance, as though the fight had cost him something more than breath and bullets. "You'll live," he said, voice low, but certain. "And when I get to town, I'll tell it straight. What happened at Dry Hollow, what Vance did. Folks'll know you're not the man they've been told you are." Gideon gave a single nod, the kind that carried both thanks and an understanding too deep for words. Aaron looked past him to where Isa was tending to the 3 small bundles by the bed. "You take care of them," he added softly. "And yourself." Isa turned, meeting Aaron's gaze for a brief moment. "Thank you," she said simply. Aaron replaced his hat, opened the door, and stepped into the cold. His figure disappeared quickly into the white, leaving the cabin quieter than it had been in days. Isa crossed the room to where Gideon sat. For a moment, she only looked at him, her eyes searching, tracing the lines of his face, like she was rediscovering an old map. Then, without hesitation, she reached for his hand. It was the first time she'd done so since the night he'd carried her from the post. No flinch, no guardedness, just the warmth of her palm against his, a bridge rebuilt after too many winters. "I was wrong," she said, her voice catching. "I believed lies because they were easier than the truth. I thought you'd left me, Gideon. I thought—" Her words faltered, but she held his hand tighter. "I'm sorry." Gideon didn't answer right away. He watched her as though weighing the years between them, the losses and the near misses. Finally, he gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "We're here now. That's enough." For the next few days they stayed close to the fire. Isa cleaned and dressed his wound each morning, her hands steady, her presence unshaken. The girls grew stronger, their cries louder, filling the small cabin with a kind of music neither Gideon nor Isa had heard in too long. When the weather eased, they talked not about the years apart, but about what came next. Leaving Bitter Creek was an option, but neither spoke of it with conviction. The mountains had held them through the storm. Perhaps they could hold them still. By the end of that week, the decision was made. The cabin would stay open to trappers, to ranch hands, passing through to anyone who needed warmth on the ridge. Gideon would hunt, mend, and guard the place. Isa would cook, tend the hearth, and keep the girls close. They worked side by side, mending the shutters, stacking new wood, patching the roof, where the wind had tried to pry it loose. With each task, the silence between them grew warmer, threaded through with the quiet understanding of people who had weathered the worst together. One evening, as the ski turned the color of old copper, Gideon stepped out onto the porch with a lantern in hand. Isa stood in the doorway, the glow from the cabin behind her, the sound of the girls' laughter faint from inside. He lit the lantern, its flame steady in the glass, despite the lingering chill. He hung it on the iron hook by the porch post, where its light spilled down toward the stream below. The water of Bitter Creek caught the reflection, carrying it downstream in trembling gold. Isai stepped out beside him. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Gideon looked at the lantern, then at her. "It'll let folks know there's a place here worth stopping at. A place to rest." She smiled, her hand finding his again. "And maybe a place to stay." The sun sank fully, leaving the world in shades of indigo. The lantern's glow stood out against the dark, a promise against the coming night. In that small circle of light, after the longest winter, either had known Gideon and Isa had found their way back to each other. There is something about stories like Gideon and Isa's that lingers long after the last page is turned. Maybe it's the way the mountains cradle them, or how the light of a single lantern can push back so much darkness. Out here in the wide silence of the frontier, second chances are rare, hard-earned, like the wood chopped for winter, or the trust rebuilt after years apart. I grew up hearing tales like this from my grandfather, his voice low by the fire, painting a world where storms were battled with grit and love was proven in actions more than words. That's what I hope you feel when you step into Bitter Creek, not just the cold and the danger, but the quiet triumph of two people who refuse to let the past have the last word. Because out here the strongest home isn't a cabin, it's the heart you keep lit.